Welcome to Future Talk. To be successful in today's competitive business world, one has to constantly innovate, constantly find new and better ways to do things. My guest today describes himself as an innovation catalyst. Thomas J. Buckholtz has worked with companies large and small, pioneering new technologies, helping their employees to become more innovative and achieve greater personal effectiveness, and saving the companies hundreds of millions of dollars in the process. He's the author of a book called Create Crucial Insight, which explains his system for catalyzing innovation. He also has a PhD in physics from the University of California, Berkeley, with undergraduate work at Caltech, and has written a book tackling some of the hardest questions in modern physics. But today, we're going to focus on his system for enhancing productivity. Tom, welcome to the program.
Marty, thank you very much for having me on the show.
And it's my pleasure, and let me start by asking you the first question. You call yourself an innovation catalyst. What exactly does that mean?
It summarizes the idea that I've been in many situations in which people together did things that were really not expected, that were really quite beneficial. And those situations have varied tremendously, some in small companies, some in large companies, some in government, a little bit out in society, not-for-profit, and even in the environment. I've just been very lucky to have helped people and organizations innovate successfully.
So how do you teach people how to innovate? Is this something that most people are capable of doing, but they just need a little coaching?
I think that most people are capable of innovating. I think people are born with a natural curiosity and abilities to do things, and I think that those skills and proclivities are retained, although sometimes suppressed. So I think it's relatively easy. It turns out that from the various situations I've been involved in, including ones in which we actually had the necessity and luxury to think about innovation and how to innovate better, I have developed some checklists or systems thinking tools that people can use, and I hope that people will use them to, first of all, look at what they're doing and maybe try to find something a little bit bigger, a little bit more impactful, a little bit more potentially significant, and then to actually, whatever they choose to do better at whatever they're doing.
Well, can you give me an example of a company you worked for where you made a difference in their outcome and what you did there to help?
Yes, let me take the example of having led a company-wide grassroots innovation program at Pacific Gas and Electric during the 1980s. The situation was wonderful. I was invited to join the computer department. People knew personal computing and other new technology was coming, and they weren't quite sure what to do with it. So it turns out that I led a company-wide grassroots innovation program, and to go to the sort of a bottom line for this before getting into details, after less than 3.5 years with the company, I gave a talk to precisely the officers of the company. And amazingly enough, I had worked with each one of them except the general counsel, so they all knew me. And I was able to report a punchline to the talk, which was, we have 5,000 computers. I've spent $20 million of the company's money, and you here in this room have signed off on recurring annual benefits of $100 million. Now, that was approximately 1.5% of revenue, and that's a kind of achievement that any large company would really like to have. And it was based on the ideas, the drive, the proclivity of people throughout the company, some clerks, some directors, people with titles in between, who came up with ideas for doing their own work better or for how people around them could do work better, and stepped up with a concept, and we backed them with some technology, and they did the work, they achieved the successes.
Is it about people cooperating with each other, knowing the jobs of other people near them so they can work more synergistically?
Things like that are definitely elements of this. There were individual successes, but many of the projects involved work groups or even work that was done throughout a 90,000 square mile service territory.
Well, what usually hinders innovation? When you go to a company and they're not innovative and they're very inefficient, what is usually the problem? What's the bottleneck holding things up?
There are many possibilities, and it's easy to generalize, but one really has to look at specific cases. Sometimes busyness has taken over from a broader perspective of business, so people are just doing what they think they have to do. Sometimes there's a climate of fear, and people are not willing to take risks. On the flip side of that, sometimes there are climates in which risk-taking is actually encouraged. There can be cultural things. There are societal cultures in which it is said that people, at least as individuals, will be very unlikely to stand up and say, I've got a new idea. In some of those cultures, one looks and says, if we couch this opportunity as a team opportunity, might that be better? And often that's a better way to approach things. So you kind of look around and see what's going on and what could happen, and encourage people to do what's appropriate in their own situations.
So do companies hire you specifically to improve the quality of their employees and get them to think more about their job and make more productive decisions?
That can be the case. The situations I think we'll probably talk about mostly here are ones in which I was actually an employee or close to being an employee in an organization, as it was with PG&E. And I like to talk about those because I saw from the inside what was going on and generated perspective over a reasonable period of time. And with PG&E, it was really nice. They gave me some executive education about the utility industry and about a sort of mini MBA program at Stanford for a couple of weeks, and at something called Public Utility Executive Program at Michigan for 4 weeks. So it was a good opportunity to see much beyond the company, and indeed I wound up actually talking about the success of our overall project and a new business practice that we pioneered for the world software marketplace with the media and eventually in public interviews and so forth.
Now, you wrote a book called Create Crucial Insight. You have a copy of it right there. Maybe you could hold it up to the camera. Okay, so create crucial insight. Does that mean that there is some kind of insight that you're trying to pass along to your clients, and once they have this insight, they'll be more personally effective?
That's a true statement, but the insight that I'm passing along is insight on how to generate your own insight. Because what really counts is people in their own situations creating crucial, better insight than they would have had before, and then using that to go into developing plans, to taking actions, to recognizing the outcomes that they've produced, and to reusing things.
Can you give an example of how you've helped someone gain an insight which they were then able to use?
Yes. Let me take one example. This is a sales and marketing example, and in this case it was a startup, and they had actually collected 3 pieces of software. I think they bought one of them from somebody else, and then 2 pieces came together some other way. I think they coded at least one of those. And they all worked together in some way, but they couldn't figure out, or they hadn't figured out, how to explain the value proposition to their customers, or their would-be customers, because they didn't really have any at that point, and to the people they wanted to invest. So it was quite possible, using one of these checklists, to ask the question, what are the customers really going to be doing, put that at the outcomes level in one of these lists, and then work back down the list, what do the customers need to accomplish or have accomplished for them in order to get to those outcomes, and then to look at the 3 pieces of software and ask, where do those services fit within these categories? So it was possible to then to envision what people were really doing, and to come up with a practical, or would be doing with the software, and to come up with a practical vision for the value added by each of those pieces of software, and then to think about how to market the practicality of it. This does not get the emotional side of it. That's something I encourage people to look at in their messaging tremendously also. But it did get them through a stumbling block, which was we don't understand how to explain the practical value of what we have to offer.
Is it a matter of framing the problem, understanding exactly what your objective is, what you're really trying to accomplish?
Yes, that's actually a very key insight that you've just given. One of the things I think people do not do adequately well as individuals or as parts of organizations is to frame issues, problems, or opportunities well. And there are certainly many opportunities for people to do this just by stopping and saying, have I done it well? What could I do? There are opportunities to use these checklists to do that framing activity much more easily, much more effectively.
So one goal might be to make as much money as possible, but another goal might be to make customers as happy as possible. And if you do that, then you have a better chance of doing the first thing.
Yes, and there are no formulas. And in fact, I'm very happy with these checklists. I designed them to be situation neutral. And so excelling for some activities, let's say in one category of how we do things based on process or lack of process, could be appropriate in one category of behavior, could be appropriate for some things and not for others for a given situation. So certainly I really encourage people to use their judgment. That's the important thing, and not to look for complete routine solutions to getting to answers.
Now, I understand that not everything you've done here is in the private sector. You've also done some work with government agencies as well. Is that a lot different from the private sector?
I got that question actually in a different form when I joined PG&E because I'd come from a startup. And I got that question again when I joined the federal government because I left PG&E to serve as a politically appointed commissioner in the United States General Services Administration. And indeed, the roles that I had in leading a 2,000-person group included being co-CIO, Chief Information Officer, for the 4 million person executive branch of the government. That was 100 of my people and 6 people in the Office of Management and Budget. I also led a $1 billion GSA business unit that sold computing and telecommunications related services to federal agencies, and there were some other parts to this job. And so people would ask me, is this different? Is this similar to what you've done before, as you've just asked? And the answer I actually have pulled into a principle which I advocate people use, and that is look for the similarities before you look for the differences. No matter what two things you're contrasting, you can always find differences. And if you stick with the differences, then you sort of people sort of wind up in this one is good except, and this one is good except, and then they're stuck. If you look for the similarities, you're going to be looking for commonality that both of those alternatives, or the many alternatives that you have, could serve. And with the similarities then, you have a framework that you can start with for evaluating whether it's even worth contrasting the differences or not. Maybe this isn't terribly significant after all, or if the differences are significant, you have a framework for evaluating which ones of those are most important.
There's some entities that are very resistant to change. They say, well, we've been doing it this way for a long time, it's worked for us, and we're comfortable, and change is uncomfortable.
I would say that as one looks at entities all the way from individuals to, in the case I had this wonderful opportunity to be really concerned about a 4 million person organization and the, at that time, 250 million Americans and other people we served, you can find in any of those situations possibly very progressive work, outcomes and behavior, and very ossified practices at the same time. Certainly the federal government is no exception to that.
Now, Silicon Valley, where we are today, is a center of innovation. It's renowned over the world. Do you think the level of innovation is sufficient, or do you think that even here, the quality of innovation, the spirit of inventiveness can be improved so people can do even more with what they have?
I'm always an optimist on this, so I go for the either even more, or if you broaden that out, let's say more impactfully, even if it's the same thing that you would have been doing, more impact from it for customers, for shareholders, for yourself, for various other constituencies, if this is a business we're talking about, for your suppliers, for your partners, and so forth, even for the marketplace. And just going back to a thing I mentioned earlier, while I was at PG&E, which is not particularly perceived of as an information technology supplier by any means, I pioneered a new business practice for the World Software Marketplace, and we got it to stick. Today it is known as the Corporate or Enterprise Software License, and it really did not exist before I got there. So this was a case of innovation outside of the scope of the mission of the company.
And PG&E is also very heavily regulated. So does that make it more difficult as far as what they can do?
I would suggest from that experience at PG&E and from my experience with the large group in the government, that actually some forms of regulation, some forms of bureaucracy can actually be an advantage. I was really sensitive to this at PG&E because in theory I regulated the use of all computing outside of mainframe computing and real-time power plant control type stuff throughout PG&E. I had that authority. And with the federal government, technically my group was regulating a good deal, some aspects of the use of computing, telecommunications, and information, by the way. That was a progressive step for much of the executive branch of the federal government. I look at regulation as an opportunity. In fact, I encourage my people in the government role there to look at their regulatory functions as a service function also. We have laws that are supposed to be complied with. We ourselves were putting out regulation for most of those 4 million people related to information technology procurement and other things related to that. So I encourage my regulatory functions, the people in them, to look at the regulation as a service, help people get through what they need to do to comply, also give them some consulting on good practices. So I wound up thinking about regulation, service, and then what in the political context would be called bully pulpit. I would have called it catalytic leadership. You can lead by what you say and what you do.
Now, can people at all levels of an organization be innovators, or is that just for people at the higher levels?
Well, the example that I gave from PG&E, I cited that there were actually people with payroll title of clerk who came up with innovations, with ideas for innovation. We did require a very brief project plan, and it turned out that that was a really good move because that meant that that clerk was getting buy-in from people up the hierarchy in his or her own organization. We required an officer's signature. You here in this room have signed off on really meant that. And so that clerk, whom I'm thinking of, who happened to be in the materials department, needed the signature of the Vice President for General Services in order to get the technology that she, in this case, was requesting. So we used the bureaucracy to help her market her great idea and get buy-in, and if you want to, cover for it. So you use the circumstance for good things, even though you can see some overtones in the word like bureaucracy.
Does it take a culture of innovation where from the top down, everybody is encouraged to think, not simply blindly follow orders, but to, because some types of enterprises, you don't want people to think, like if you're just doing the same repetitive task all day long.
The PG&E case is a very interesting one because even though I had, within a few years, worked with all but one of the officers of the company on something individually, I never went to any of them and said, I want your sponsorship. We never quoted them in our newsletter that came out of my group, as far as I can remember. We built this as an organic grassroots movement. And to look at what happened, actually a few years after what I just told you, that speech, I went to a brown bag lunch and somebody asked the CEO of the company, what do you think are the most important things going forward for PG&E? And I was stunned because the CEO went straight to information and information technology as a first theme to talk about. But we never actually asked for that kind of endorsement. So you don't actually have to have it. I'm living proof that you don't need it.
And speaking of information technology, you wrote another book, which you also have on the table here. Maybe we could take a look at that. It's called Information Proficiency. And what's the message that you're trying to get across in that book?
Okay, Marty, thanks for asking this. This book was written after my government service, and I really wanted people to think about the opportunities that they and society and everything in between, individuals through society, have in the information age. So this is a timeless book. It's out of print, but the message in it is really quite timely now. And it really is to, among other things, to start to think from a broader perspective, as we've talked about before, to start to think about outcomes that would really matter, and then to work your way into more specific things like what do we need to do and what plans might we have and what issues do we really need to resolve in order to get there. And somewhere far down on that list is actually questions of resources, including who should be involved and what technologies we might use and office space and all the other sorts of things that you really need. So I'm encouraging people, among other things, from time to time, not always, but from time to time, look at the big picture, plan downward, and also to recognize that success builds from the bottom up. You don't get very far if you don't have the people and other resources or somebody who can supply what those people would have supplied.
Now, information technology is really changing the world in unbelievable ways. It's changed the face of almost everything. Is there anything we can do to reduce the risk that something bad is going to happen from this excessive information that we're being bombarded with all the time?
The excessive information actually gives me an opportunity to talk about something else. When I joined the government, I found that GSA was in the middle of strategic planning. And so I inherited a draft mission statement for the group that I was starting to lead. And mercifully, it focused on an information-rich environment for federal employees. So it's beginning to speak toward the topic that you've just brought up. And I liked that because intuitively I knew that people could have come up with a mission statement that said, great telecommunications and computing products and services, which actually is the sort of the gist that GSA had for its overall mission statement for a broader set of services. But it took me about 1 second, and this was 1989, for my mind to flash from information-rich environment to potential information overload. So I recognized that, and I personally recrafted the vision for what we'd be doing, came up with the mission statement of information proficiency, focus on effective use of information to get things done, and images of proficiency with information to make decisions and set goals, proficiency through information to communicate and implement the decisions and get done something like what you might want. So I was very much into the type of question. These are going to be eternal questions. I would suggest if people are looking at the broad picture that actually information overload has been with us for a long, long time, but we're now beginning to see something else, and that is an overload of requests for information, surveys, and all sorts of other things directly or rather covertly in some sense, asking for information. I think people should broaden out the question you just asked and start to look not only at information overload, but at the taxing effects on individuals and society of direct or indirect requests to contribute information.
Or not even requests, they could just take it without your permission.
That's another facet
One of the
this.
problems of information overload is that you can't have secrets anymore. Everything you do can be tracked. Is that a problem?
My stock answer for all of these things is there are opportunities and there are problems.
Now, Tom, you've also spoken a lot about leadership and the need for good leadership. What's the relationship between leadership and innovation? Are good leaders necessarily good innovators, or are they totally different types of skills?
I think that all skills tend to overlap, and so there's no reason for people to think of these as distinct. In fact, I've taught a course called Leadership and Innovation before, and it's easy to blend the two. I think that leaders differ in styles. They differ in, there's a lot of similarities, go back to my theme, but there are differences in styles, there are differences in circumstances, there are differences in interests. So does a leader have to be directly an innovator? Maybe not, if they have a good crew around them and they catalyze a culture or sustain a culture in which innovation is expected and risks can be taken and so forth. The leader does not necessarily have to be known as a great innovator, but could be known as someone who fostered innovation and moved his or her organization forward that way.
Are there any particular traits that are essential for leaders? For example, having a clearer vision of where you want to go and being able to convey it to others so they can buy into it themselves?
Yes, I think that getting a vision around, getting people participating in formulating visions and missions and so forth, and people taking advantage of that clarity is very important. At PG&E, we never had a goal for my project. It's maybe amazing to say that, but we did come up with 7 principles very early on, and we could market those principles. They had to do with doing work better and some other sort of common sense things. And then we could even make decisions. And indeed, once in a while, I got a request that had been signed off by an officer saying, I back this project. And I would look at the principles and say, this violates sufficiently badly, sufficiently much, one of the principles of the project. So I would overrule, unfortunately, that person's request and that officer's signature and say, no, you are not going to get your technology. We may want to rework this somehow, but this request is not going through. So I think that having a vision, having principles, if not goals, being able to operate that way, number one, makes it easier to make decisions, and number two, makes it easier for people to follow on from those decisions, and number three, encourages people to make decisions that are in the same spirit as the principles and other ideas that are behind the decisions and visions that you're announcing.
We just have about half a minute left. Where are you going to go from here? What are your plans now? Do you have plans to take this whole approach anyplace?
I want coaches and other people to use this approach. I want partners in the coaching community, also in the software community, to develop this into enterprise and community software. I think there's a tremendous opportunity for societal, corporate, government, and individual benefit.
Great. And we are going to have to leave it right there because we are out of time. I've been speaking with Thomas J. Buckholtz, Innovation Catalyst. Tom, thanks for being here. A pleasure to have you.
Marty, thank you tremendously.
Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Marty Wasserman. We'll see you next time.